Good morning, and welcome to our post-conference institute of the Signs of Destiny 2004 conference here on Monday morning at the Tempe Embassy Suites in Tempe, Arizona. And I'm your host, Dr. Chet Snow. Today it is my great privilege to have once again one of our keynote speakers of the weekend, John Major Jenkins. John is an independent scholar from Colorado, living in the Denver area, and he has been involved in working with the great spiritual traditions, especially those of Central America, but also the Vedic tradition, the Egyptian traditions, and how these times that we are now in, times of transition, times of change, that have been long predicted, how they are reflected in these traditions. And today he's going to present a very unique perspective, that of a lost AZTEC codex called the Pyramid of Fire, which, as he mentioned in his talk the other night, was first discovered only in the 1960s and then sort of lay dormant until into the 1990s, and he got involved with helping it get translated and getting out to the wider public. And this is a brand new book that he has just had brought out called The Pyramid of Fire, The Lost AZTEC Codex, Spiritual Ascension at the End of Time. So without further ado, John Major Jenkins.
Thank you, Chet. I'd like to say once again that I'm very grateful for having been invited here to speak with you this weekend. It's been an amazing experience for me. It's always great to connect with people that are interested in these things and other researchers that are doing interesting work as well. Spiritual Ascent at the End of Time. That is the subtitle of the book. And just a show of hands, how many were here for my Friday night talk? Okay, quite a few. Not everybody. So what I've sort of designed here is a little bit of a survey and summary of what I talked about on Friday, because it's really essential, because it really does lead into a discussion of the metaphysical implications of the main part of my work. Those lights are pretty bright. Is there any way to sort of shade those in any way? Okay. All right. Like the deer in the headlights kind of thing. Because my work really has involved trying to identify the core principles at the heart of the sacred calendar. And also the key thing that I talked about on Friday, and what is the sort of the centerpiece of my work with identifying why the early Maya sky watchers picked the year that we call 2012 to end this vast cycle of time, has to do with this galactic alignment, this rare astronomical alignment to the galactic center. And that's sort of the astronomical key, but as you get deeper into the spiritual meaning of that, you can sort of delve more deeply into that, and you find that there's teachings in the Maya creation myth involving the sacred ball game and king accession rites, king crowning rituals, and so on. And you find that these core traditions in Mayan civilization are using this astronomical galactic alignment to say something very important about the spiritual journey here on Earth. And what it really involves is initiation, spiritual initiation into a renewed relationship with our cosmic heart and source. I mean, maybe that's the way to think about it. And so the underlying backdrop sort of process that really can help us understand what this is about is the alignment of the December solstice sun with the galactic center, the womb of the Great Mother. So that's where we're at in the great cycle of precession, the great cycle of 26,000 years. We're approaching the great collective spiritual birth point. And it is the end of time, you might say. It's the end of a cycle. It's not the obliteration of time or the, ending of Earth, so to speak. It's the end of a cycle. And so, in a sense, you can speak about it as being like the end of time. But what does the end of time mean in a spiritual sense? what is it to experience the cessation of the flow of time? Probably a lot of people here would have something to say about that, because it's basically a spiritual experience that many of us have glimpsed in altered states of consciousness or during some spiritual work, or perhaps even in dreams, or encounters with, perhaps even in crop circles, people have an altered, experience of time. And the thing about it is that when we get into the material about this, we find that ancient traditions, especially the Central Mexican tradition that I'll be talking about tonight, the Central Mexican tradition that basically put down in pictographic form spiritual teachings about what happens or what can be experienced when time ends. The Pyramid of Fire, pictographic manuscript, and I'll be talking about this. This will be the sort of centerpiece of the talk tonight. But what we're going to do, the way that I'm going to kind of approach this is through building up to doing direct readings from the 13 transcribed pages. And I'll be reading the pages and making a commentary, or sort of engaging even in a dialogue. What I'd like to do is provide a survey of what we talked about on Friday and leading up to this work. And at about 10 to 11, I'd like to have a break. I think it'd be good to sort of stand up and stretch our legs. But for about 10 minutes before that break, I'd like to sort of open it up for questions a little bit. So that can be a time when you can ask some questions about the Pyramid of Fire or about anything that I've talked about this weekend. And then we'll take a break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll really get into the readings, the direct readings from the 13 pages. Well, as I talked about on Friday, Izapa is an early Mayan site in southern Mexico. It's right on the Guatemala border. And it does seem to be the place where the long count calendar that gives us the 2012 date was invented. It's also the place where the Maya creation myth was invented, or, we find the first pictographic portrayals of the creation myth carved on stone at the site. And a lot of this was reconstructed in my book, Maya Cosmogenesis 2012. And the key to understanding this is the alignment of the solstice sun over many thousands of years has been coming into alignment with the bright band of the Milky Way and that part of the Milky Way that contains the galactic center. And that is the galactic alignment. And that's a very rare astronomical alignment. It's not like, in the popular song from the 60s, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, when the Jupiter aligns with Mars and, the moon is in Aquarius or something like that. That's a sort of a poetic way of talking about the change of ages, some kind of planetary alignment. But it's not so much about planetary alignments. It's really about our shifting orientation to the larger galactic framework, the precession of the equinoxes. It causes the sun on the equinoxes or the solstices to slowly shift in the sky against the background features of constellations in the Milky Way and so on. But it's really caused by the wobbling of the Earth. So it's really this process that's changing our angular orientation to the larger galactic framework. And so it's reasonable to think that these kind of changing orientations to the larger galactic picture do have something to do with changes on Earth. And one way to sort of look at it, if we were a sky watcher, say at Izapa 2,000 years ago, we would see the Milky Way with the galactic center arching quite high above the dawning December solstice sun. But over a period of, say, 2,000 years, there's a convergence that takes place. And when you look at the mythology in simple form, the Milky Way was seen in many different ways, but it's primarily seen to be the Great Mother. And then this dark rift feature would be the birth canal of the Great Mother, and this would be the womb of the Great Mother. So this is the sort of the cosmic mother principle. And the December solstice sun is the cosmic father principle. So really what we have culminating in the years around 2012, in the times that we are living in, is this rare astronomical alignment. But the Maya were very intuitive in how they understood this, and they didn't limit their understanding to astronomy. In fact, the astronomy indicated something spiritual going on, which was basically the union of Shiva and Shakti, we might say, the union of cosmic mother and cosmic father, the union of the yin principle and the yang principle. So that's the sort of the energies that's coming into Earth these days. You know, it's an energy that's coming into the local space-time field, you might say, or you know, it's an energy that's bathing the Earth to a greater extent than it has in the past, and it's challenging human beings to integrate these two principles as they live and exist inside of our bodies, inside of our, you know, psycho-spiritual constitutions. That challenge of integrating those energies is largely, I think, it's what the spiritual journey is about. Because when you can bring those two energies together, that's what fuels the generation of Amrit, the nectar of consciousness. And it's a great aid for our spiritual growth. At Izapa, there is one key monument, among many, actually, but this one is particularly striking in how it represents the end date alignment. This monument was carved over 2,000 years ago. And when you look at the symbology, we see that it's the December solstice sun, God, one Hunapu. His arms are outstretched. That's like a period-ending measuring device. And he himself is kind of like the great cross in the sky, but he's part of this vertical axis mundi, consisting of this jaguar toad with an open mouth. And this whole thing here is like the Milky Way, and so the mouth is like the dark rift in the Milky Way. It's basically that December solstice sun, not just any sun. You know, the sun actually crosses through the Milky Way every year at any epoch in history, but it's when the December solstice sun aligns with this part of the Milky Way that is the key to understanding the spiritual transformation on Earth today. Now, on Friday, I did talk about how the Big Dipper rises and falls over Takana volcano to the north of the site of Izapa. The site of Izapa is oriented in really critical and interesting ways to horizon astronomy and also to geological features on the horizon, like this volcano is to the north, and the entire site is oriented northwards to where the Big Dipper rises over this volcano. And that happens every night. You know, Big Dipper rises and falls, and the Big Dipper in the Maya creation myth is Seven Macaw, the bird deity, the celestial bird deity. He's the ruler of the previous world age. He was actually the deity that was preferred by the earlier Olmec people, but as the Izapans came to the fore, who are really the precursors of the Maya people, they instituted a cosmological revolution in understanding how the sky moves. And what they noticed at the site of Izapa is that the Big Dipper, beginning about 3000 BC, now as Jeff said in his presentation, Izapa really was the first habitation there at the site really goes back to about 1500 BC. It seems like the heyday of Izapa was probably between maybe 600 BC until it kind of suddenly was abandoned around 100 AD, and all the monuments were left, you know, to be found some 1800 years later, as they were left by archaeologists in the 1950s and so on. But beginning about 3000 BC, the Big Dipper had kind of a tight circle around the pole star, North Celestial Pole. And then because of precession, you know, the slow wobbling, it exerts very strange kind of changes in different parts of the sky. And it's been causing the Big Dipper to move farther and farther away from the North Celestial Pole. You know, especially after about 1000 BC, it started to really move quickly. And so there's this major change going on here. In the Maya creation myth, they said that Seven Macaw fell from his perch. He fell from grace. He kind of got out of control. He became a megalomaniac. He was the vain and false ruler of the previous world age, and he had to be done away with. So the hero twins shot him off his perch, and he fell. Well, this is the image of Seven Macaw falling off his perch. He's falling away from the pole star, and it's a precessional-based mythos. That's happening in the north. Meanwhile, in the south, as we saw just a moment ago, the December solstice sun has been converging with its throne, a galactic throne. So polar throne and galactic throne. So I'm going to toggle through about 6 slides here, and we'll see how the simultaneous process over a period of about 2,000 years of Seven Macaw falling away from his throne, and at the same time, one Hunahpu, the December solstice sun, is converging with his throne. Okay, so each jump is about 300 years or so. And that's what's really encoded in the Maya creation mythology. It's an encoding of a precessional process and a cosmological revolution, a cosmological shift in understanding from the older Olmec paradigm, which was polar, to the new emerging Mayan galactic cosmology or galactic paradigm, which preferred to see this as the anchor point for the dawn of a new age. For them, the distant future, but for us, in the very near future. And one thing to think about that's interesting is, to reconstruct these ancient cosmologies is one thing, and I think it's what drew me to this work is to sort of like delve into these fragmented aspects of ancient Maya cosmology, because none of this really survives. It had to be reconstructed from the monuments of Izapa. So you can have sort of a reconstruction of this amazing galactic cosmology. We don't have to believe it ourselves. This is sort of the caveat that I put before, professional astronomers and scholars who, for some reason, immediately think that, this means that this means that the galactic alignment, has some kind of transformative effects on Earth. Well, it probably does. Actually, my intuition is that it does. But then they want me to somehow prove it empirically to say, well, how does the galactic alignment actually, transform consciousness? Well, to me, they're two separate discussions, really, to reconstruct the ancient cosmology in the same way that we might reconstruct ancient Greek medicine or something like that. We don't have to believe it ourselves. But having said that, one thing to think about is that basically the ancient Maya said that the time around 2012 would be a time of great transformation. Well, look around us. I mean, if that's not proof of the pudding, I don't know what is. It's just in the last 100 years, space flight, computer technology, resealable plastic bags. I mean, there's so much going on right now, it's unbelievable. And it does seem to be speeding up to converge on some sort of transformative nexus in the near future. As I said on Friday, I kind of went into this through the 3 core sacred science principles that can be identified at the heart of the sacred calendar, and how those 3 principles, logos, eros, dios, intellect, emotion, will, these things actually live inside of us. They're sort of like inner faculties that are really part of our own spiritual awakening. To bring these 3 aspects into harmony is really critical for individuation, as Carl Jung might say, or coming into becoming a whole being. And at Izapa, there are 3 main monument groups. The ball courts up here, Group B and Group A are over here, and they're each dedicated to their own cosmic center. As I said, Group A has monuments that are depicting the Big Dipper Seven Macaw deity. A lot of the monuments there are portraying the Big Dipper, the bird. And the galactic ball court we'll get into here in a minute, that's that actually points to the December solstice sunrise, the ball court there. So it's dedicated to that convergence in the sky that's happening with the galactic center over the southeastern horizon, the December solstice sunrise. And Group B, which we didn't really talk about on Friday, I'm going to get into this a little bit because it brings up this other kind of scenario with an alignment of the Pleiades and the sun in the zenith of the sky. And this is really critical for what we'll be talking about with the Pyramid of Fire Codex, because the Pyramid of Fire Codex is a 13-stage journey from creation to ekpyrosis. Ekpyrosis is a term that means the universal conflagration at the end of time. The spiritual meaning of this is that at the end of a cycle, materialism dissolves back into the spiritual essence from which all arises. And the image is one of burning. The images of conflagration, that apocalyptic idea of the world burning to a cinder. It's actually a spiritual meaning of the purification of illusion to merge back into the eternal, infinite background matrix, you might say. And so the 13th page of the Pyramid of Fire Codex is basically about the new fire ceremony. And the new fire ceremony was performed at the end of each 52-year calendar round period by the Central Mexicans especially. They also performed it at Chichen Itza, which is really, we're going to find a key insight here at Chichen Itza about how the Izapans, and then especially the Central Mexicans, as well as the later Mayan people, thought about this convergence between the sun and the Pleiades and the zenith, and how they thought about that. And there are 3 deities associated with each one of these cosmic centers. Group B at Izapa, as I mentioned, is dedicated to the zenith center. The zenith is the exact center of the sky overhead, and within the tropical latitudes, like Izapa is at 15 degrees north latitude, the sun can pass right through the center of the sky. Within the tropics, it can do that. Further north, like where Phoenix is and New York City and so on, and further south, like getting into South America and so on, it just doesn't work. The sun, even on the June solstice, never quite reaches the zenith. It arches pretty high, but it just never quite makes it. So only within the tropics can the sun pass right through the zenith throne. And depending specifically on your latitude, it does so on 2 different days of the year, and depending on your latitude, the days change a little bit. Now, Izapa is interesting because at Group B, it has these vertical pillars, and this is like the sun on top of the vertical pillar, and then there's shadow casting devices. So it's a way to measure the movements of the sun. And then on the zenith passage day at high noon, the sun is directly overhead, so there's no shadows cast. And the 2 dates in the year at Izapa are August 12th and May 1st. Both of these dates are interesting. August 12th is the date in the solar year that the long count calendar began back in 3114 BC. It's the first day. The 0 day is August 11th, and the first day is August 12th. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And then May 1st, of course, is one of the cross quarters, halfway between the equinox and the solstice. Okay, so we're going to take a little side trip to modern-day Chichen Itza. I was at Chichen Itza just a couple of months ago to watch the amazing event that happens there, the shadow serpent. A lot of you are probably familiar with this, how on the March equinox, or the fall equinox, actually, the sun casts its shadow against this corner here and makes these diamond shapes against the northern stairway, and there's a serpent head here at the bottom. So it's the descent of the serpent. It's the return of Quetzalcoatl to enliven and regenerate the local situation at the equinoxes. So I was there in September. It was great to see this event. It's really quite striking. Especially in March, thousands of people go to see this. I mean, it also happens in the September equinox too. But thousands of people come to see this. And it really is an amazing architectural design achievement for the Maya to have placed this pyramid of Kukulkan. Kukulkan is the Mayan Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, the serpent bird. It's an amazing achievement for them to have placed this in such a way that it highlights this event. And actually, I kind of had a sense that there might be other things going on around the site while this was happening in terms of shadow casting. So just 100 or so feet away from the Pyramid of Kukulkan is the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza. And I went over there, and I noticed that the shadow being cast by the western wall of the ball court was going right down the middle of the ball court. So I think this is significant because it indicates a balance situation, a balance between light and dark, which is actually what the equinoxes are too. It's halfway between the solstices. The solstice points are extremes, you know, and the equinox points are balance points between the two extremes. Now, a major part of my work that I explored in Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, doing my research in the early 90s and mid-90s, I was trying to, figure out what these Mayan traditions were about, and I was especially interested in the new field of archaeoastronomy, or astroarchaeology, and it has to do with how sites are placed and oriented in relation to stars rising on the horizon and so on. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of encoded information on the monuments and as well with their orientations. Now, as Jeff pointed out, there's something deeper encoded into this phenomenon of the shadow serpent appearing on the equinox. And I was able to reconstruct that, yes, there is this shadow that appears on the northern stairway with the serpent head at the bottom, happens on the equinox every year. But the tail of the serpent, you have to sort of extrapolate and envision that the tail of the serpent would be pointing straight up into the zenith. In fact, in the symbolism of Mayan pyramids, they think of the top platform as pointing up into the zenith. I mean, that's just something that is known. The four sides of the pyramid represent the four directions, and then the center of the pyramid is the fifth direction. And the fifth direction in Mayan cosmology is the zenith direction. So you have to sort of imagine the tail of the serpent pointing up into the zenith of the sky. And then you find that there's a symbol. There's actually two symbols on the serpent tail. One is the rattle, and Yucatec Maya word for rattle is tzab. And it's also the word for the Pleiades. So to me, this was a key. And another symbol on the tail is this little 3-dot emblem that you find on the Crotalus dorissus snake of the Yucatan. It's a little 3-dot thing that's the Mayan symbol for the sun. So this is encoding sort of a secret esoteric knowledge about something else going on, not just the visible exoteric manifestation on the equinoxes, but it's pointing to a subtle esoteric alignment of the sun and the Pleiades in the zenith. So that's interesting. That's a deeper layer of this phenomenon that hasn't been noticed before. What's interesting about the sun and the Pleiades in the zenith over Chichen Itza is that it's not something that happens every year. In fact, it's determined by precession. There's an era or an epoch of precession in which this culminates and comes to fruition over Chichen Itza. It's a latitude-specific thing because, again, it involves the sun and the zenith. So when this happens, which is actually going to be May 20th, when this happens is determined by the latitude. But say the thing is that it's a precessional alignment, so although the sun reaches the zenith on May 20th every year over Chichen Itza, and that doesn't change with precession, the sun is not going to be aligned with the Pleiades the Sun and the Pleiades come to alignment only in the 21st century. So it's coordinating this cosmology, which is actually happening in one part of the sky, with the basic galactic alignment cosmology that was pioneered at Izapa, the alignment of the solstice sun with the galactic center, which is happening in the opposite part of the sky. So you get this two-part cosmology involving the galactic center and the galactic anti-center, and if we sort of turn that upright, then we see how it's like an evolutionary axis. And these two different alignments that are happening in these two opposite parts of the sky are both pinpointing the 21st century as a time of great transformation. And there's, as I was saying, that there's an entire sort of mythos around the zenith cosmology and the galactic cosmology. And especially what I think is interesting here is that there are two deities associated with this cosmology. Earlier I was talking about a sort of a dialectic or a polarity between Seven Macaw, the polar deity, and One Hunahpu, the galactic deity, and that does seem to be a true polarity. But there's a triangulation going on because there's a polarity between One Hunahpu and Quetzalcoatl, the Pleiades, the sun and the Pleiades in the zenith. So I think this is sort of like one of the ways to think about the return of Quetzalcoatl myth, which is sort of the central Mexican resurrection motif of the return of Quetzalcoatl. And the thing that's interesting about this is this isn't just some free-floating astronomical theory or something, because you find it supported by all the iconography and the pictograms around the site of Izapa. You find these two different deities always in some kind of alliance or union or battle. It's Captain Sundisk and Captain Serpent. See the serpent wound around him. Captain Serpent is Quetzalcoatl, and Captain Sundisk is One Hunahpu. So it's about a cosmological unification at Chichen Itza. The way that I sort of think about it is that there was a schism that happened, a split that happened in the Mesoamerican psyche sometime early on. And so there were two different sort of approaches to the world age doctrine that happened. Like in central Mexico, you had one, gave rise to the Toltecs and the Aztecs and so on, and the new fire ceremony is the key to understanding that. And then you had the Maya with their long count calendar and their galactic cosmology. And they finally came together at Chichen Itza sometime in the 9th century AD. So it's pretty fascinating, interesting stuff in terms of reconstructing the esoteric metaphysical dimensions of Mesoamerican history. Now, the three groups and the three centers and the three deities. And we're going to go to the ball court now to review real quick. All right, doing good. This is the ball court at Izapa. And over the lengthwise axis of the ball court, you have the December solstice sun rising. It's converging with the galactic center. I don't want to be too repetitive here. There's an entire cosmology encoded into the ball game involving this throne here. And the throne symbolizes the galactic alignment in three different ways. The game ball going into the goal ring is the December solstice sun going into the dark rift or the galactic center. And the little head that's being chewed up by this little serpent mouth is the same thing. And then this godhead, solar godhead, coming out from between the legs of this throne, like if you were sitting on the throne, it's like a birth image. So you have like a birth metaphor, a death metaphor, and the ball game. The ball game says that we are indispensable participants in this process of death and rebirth and transformation at the end of the age. It's an initiatory sort of image. And the cosmic symbolism of the sacred ball game is really central. It really is about the galactic alignment. It's about world renewal. And it's about an ascension of consciousness that happens. And it's about our relationship with the heart of creation, the mysteries of death and rebirth. So to summarize, I think it's hard to talk about 2012 without talking about Izapa. It's really sort of the ground zero of the 2012 prophecy. I took the sort of self-evident approach of looking at the site that invented the calendar that gives us 2012 to understand something about the core insights into what 2012 is about. And we find that there is this astronomical underpinning to it, but then there's a whole set of metaphysical teachings, initiatory. There's something about the site that's initiatory, which is very interesting because, you know, most traditions that involve initiation, it's like it requires a symbolic sacrifice or a symbolic death in order to awaken to a higher life or a second birth, coming into correct orientation to the cosmic center and source, the heart of creation. And so it's really something that I think should be looked at. And as with crop circles, what I sort of felt intuitively is that going to the site of Izapa is going to be important as we get closer to 2012. I've been there 4 times, and it's really a pleasant site. It's in a kind of a hot part of Mexico. It's sort of close to the Pacific coast. Not real close, but there's no huge temples there, but there's something about just being at the site. It's kind of like crop circles in that, something to be experienced. So stay in touch with me if you're interested in doing tours to Izapa, because I've started to do tours. We did one last year. We were going to do one this year, but we canceled it at the last minute. But next year we're going to start it up and do it at kind of a different time of the year, because early December was when we were doing it, and it doesn't really seem to be a good time to do it. It'd actually be better to do it in February, so that if we got out there to the site, we would actually see in, say, early February, we would see something like this, right? You know, we'd see the Milky Way and so on over the December solstice horizon. We would be seeing what they were seeing on the December solstice 2,000 years ago. So the way that, I think what I found in identifying and working with the principles that seem to be encoded into, say the ball court, the symbology. How do we think about that symbolism with death and rebirth? What's that all about? You know, how do we translate that symbolic language into a spiritual teaching, I guess is how you'd say it. Well, luckily they're universal symbols, so they can be translated into something recognizable. What I found is that my intuitive sense is that teaching in the Izapan ball court is very, very similar to what Aldous Huxley wrote about the perennial philosophy. And it's sort of like universal principles that apply to human spiritual unfolding. And you find these principles in many different traditions. That's why it's perennial. That's why it's universal. In fact, you usually find these principles at the core of all the great esoteric and religious traditions around the world. And it basically boils down to these 4 points, which are: the entire world, including individualized consciousness, arises from an unmanifest eternal divine ground. Okay, so like that which comes into incarnation, that which is born into the world of generation, birth, growth, and ultimately death. It's a limited world in the sense that it's the world of finite manifestation. Anything that comes into manifestation in the entire world arises from an unmanifest eternal divine ground. And human beings are capable of direct experience of the divine ground. Direct experience. It's not that we can say much about it. We can't sort of convey or explain or describe that experience in words. I mean, that's what religions try to do, and religions also try to provide a path to have this experience. And what I think is that initiatory religions are like that, in that they offer a path to get into touch with this eternal divine ground, have a glimpse, and then to know, then it's like one's individual ego becomes oriented correctly towards the center and source of all creation. Human beings possess a double nature consisting of a finite ego self and an eternal divine self. And the purpose of human life is to reunite with the higher divine self, which is the source, center, and ground of all manifestation. Well, that's kind of what I think is, the galactic alignment symbolizes. It's telling us that we have this opportunity to align ourselves with the center and source of all creation. And it's actually a good time to do spiritual work, because there can be a lot of progress made while the door is open. So this sort of opens the door to talking about how the galactic alignment is not just a Mayan insight, although we find it very beautifully expressed in the traditions of Izapa and in the core institutions of Mayan civilization, like the King of Session rites and the ball game and the creation myth. We find a beautiful expression of what I'd call the galactic cosmology in Mayan civilization. It's really phenomenal. But at the same time, after writing Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, published in '98, I had to ask myself, well, gosh, it's such an amazing insight into cosmic process. I wonder if other traditions around the world had tuned into this as well. And so I started looking, and the book Galactic Alignment was the result. And what I found, that there are tantalizing glimpses in many of the world's esoteric traditions that point to an esoteric understanding of this. And one of the traditions that I just like to focus on is Mithraism, which we see here in the upper right, the Mithraic mysteries. Because what we'll find in the Mithraic mysteries is that there's a teaching about the two celestial gateways in the sky. One of these gateways is centered upon the galactic center, and the other celestial gateway is at the galactic anti-center. And here we see the Milky Way and the ecliptic, the path of the sun, moon, and planets. It forms a cross in the sky. This crossing point of the Milky Way and the ecliptic is also seen on the sarcophagus lid of Pakal, the great king of Palenque from the 7th century. You have the vertical and the horizontal double-headed serpent column. Let me see here. The double-headed serpent bar is the ecliptic, and then the tree is the Milky Way. Now, the crossing point of the Milky Way and the ecliptic was defined by a Neoplatonic philosopher from the late 4th century. Macrobius was his name, and he identified this crossing point as the true location of the two celestial gateways, not Capricorn and Cancer, as is generically sort of referred to in some of the Greek literature. And the Sagittarian gateway is the gate of the gods, or the gate of ascension. And the Gemini gateway is the gate of mankind. It's the gate through which souls descend into incarnation or manifestation. So you can kind of picture this circle in the sky, coming down from the divine, unmanifest, eternal Empyrean, coming into manifestation to be born, and traveling the road of life, and then reascending back into the unmanifest ground of all being at the end of life. That's why at the end of our individual life, it's like an ascension back into the divine, eternal background, but also initiatory experiences, or the initiation, is like an ascension as well. So at the end of our lives and at the end of a cycle of time, there is like a spiritual ascent that occurs. The other Neoplatonic philosopher, Porphyry, in his text called The Cave of the Nymphs, this title of his text is actually referential to an episode from Homer's Odyssey going back to 800 BC. So he was actually commenting on a very old spiritual tradition of the early Greeks. And he said that, as Numenius and his friend Cronius affirm, it is necessary, in order to elucidate the reason of the position of the gates, to observe that there are two extremities in the heavens, the winter solstice and the summer solstice. Theologists consider Cancer and Capricorn as the two ports. Plato called them two gates. Of these, they affirm that Cancer is the gate through which souls descend, and Capricorn, that through which they ascend. But these gates actually, according to Macrobius, these gates are actually located nearby. See, it's kind of generic to say that it's Capricorn and Cancer. The specific location of these gates are where the Milky Way and the zodiac intersect. And these are very important points in Mayan cosmology as well. It's actually the points where the galactic alignment culminates in the years around 2012. So we have the 12 signs of the zodiac. Here's Sagittarius, and here's Scorpio. And they're kind of portrayed in a reverse image kind of way. It's kind of, generic the way that they're portrayed here. But you have the galactic center in one part of the sky and the galactic edge in the other part of the sky, or the galactic anti-center. And here we have the vernal equinox. So the way that some writers talk about this phenomenon, too, is that it's not so much a galactic alignment, but it's an equinox cross. Those are two different ways of referring to the same thing that's happening in 2012. Because when the solstices align with the galactic center, or the Milky Way, the equinoxes are in a situation of a cross. Like, for example, there's an amazing book by Vincent Bridges and Jay Widener. It came out about a year ago. It's called The Mystery of the Cross at Henday. And I like to sort of integrate and summarize the work of other independent researchers. That's what I did in Galactic Alignment, to sort of contextualize this amazing independent work that's being done, to show that this galactic alignment material is like an unrecognized layer, even in the history of science and religion from the old world. Not just in the study of Mayan cosmology, but it seems to be a very deep layer of gnosis that's been unrecognized until now. The galactic center definitely is a key player in a lot of the religions, although it hasn't been recognized. The galactic center is pointed to by the Sagittarian archer. It's pointed to by the stinger of the Scorpion constellation. It's also pointed to by Ophiuchus, sometimes referred to as the 13th constellation, not technically one of the 12 zodiacal constellations. So something very ancient in the astrological understanding of the signs is definitely present here. Now, what I've explored too is the work of art historian Ananda Coomaraswamy, because his insights into the mythology of Sagittarius is very, very interesting. He explores the Sagittarian archer and finds that the Sagittarian archer is like guarding the galactic center. This is sort of like the door to heaven, in a sense. It's the sun door at world's end, is how Coomaraswamy refers to it. The sun door at world's end. The door that opens up into the heaven realm at the end of the cycle, or during the initiatory experience, or at death. And so this Sagittarian archer and the Scorpion, there's always two guardians. There's sort of two dual twins that guard the door of heaven. And they're actually like projections of our own readiness to pass through the barrier back into the realm of unity. Sometimes they're portrayed as winged sphinx, guarding like the vessel that contains the Amrit nectar of immortality. Coomaraswamy. There's a great book that just came out, a collection of his essays called Guardians of the Sun Door. There's a Sagittarian archer there. One of his books was a collection of his essays published by Princeton University. The title of the book was called The Door in the Sky. And that's pretty evocative of the end date alignment, the door that opens up at the end of the cycle to take us back into the heart of creation. in not necessarily in a way of, in the sense of boarding the mothership to go back to the home planet or something like that. I guess that's one way to think about it. But what I think about is sort of like reawakening us to have an authentic, integrated whole relationship with our cosmic source and remaining in the world, really. Transcendence is inclusive of what it transcends. I think that's a core principle that we find actually in the Pyramid of Fire. It's really an amazing thing. When we transcend the world, we don't leave the world. We're still in the world. It's like the Bodhisattva vow. It's like being able to effectively be in the world and coming from a place that is basically transcendent to the world. We'll get into that a little bit more. I should probably, follow the text on that. Now another thing where, okay, we got 10 o'clock. Another thing where these cycles of time and having to do with the ascent at the end of time, ascent and descent. There's always, in any cycle, from the day to the month to the year to the great cycle of precession, you have a descending half and an ascending half. And that was a really important insight that Sri Yukteswar, the master of Yogananda from the Self-Realization Fellowship, he really brought that home in terms of when he was talking about the yugas. The Hindu yugas are the world age, the world ages in the Hindu Vedic concept of precession, really, because what we find is that the yugas add up to 12,000 years, but that's only one half of the full cycle of the yugas. It's like, say, the descent half. And in that descent process, we go from an ancient time of the Golden Age, which is the Satya Yuga, and then we move into the Silver Age, and then the Bronze Age, and then finally we're in the Iron Age, the age of Kali Yuga, the age of greatest materialism. So there's a process of reduction that's going on. This is very counter to the myth of progress that we find in this, in the scientific paradigm. Thinks that, oh, now we have the atomic bomb. We've progressed to the highest pinnacle of achievement, or something like that. That scientific or industrial achievement is some kind of sign of spiritual advance or something. It's ridiculous. There's a myth of progress, that, science will solve all problems, just give it time. We'll, don't worry about the rainforest being destroyed. We'll figure it out, But actually what it is, it's the inverse. The manifestation and the discoveries of all these technological things is a sign that we're entering into deeper and deeper realms of materialism, really. I mean, the materialistic age has its own kind of magic, in a sense, in that we have space flight and computer technology and so on, but it's not a sign of spiritual advance. That's pretty unpopular to say that, but what we have here then, though, this is just half of the cycle, the descent half. And then, when we reach a point of maximum descent, the end of Kali Yuga, we turn the corner, and then we reascend and go back through the process. So it's kind of like that image of the two gateways on both sides of the sky, where we have coming into manifestation, descending into incarnation, going through life, and then reascending at the end of the cycle. And to me, the key to understanding this, even the Vedic Yuga doctrine, is the solstice galaxy alignment that happens in the years around 2012. We see the descent through the various yugas, and then we turn the corner here. This is kind of like galactic midnight. This is where we are right now. See the point here? That's the galactic center. The galactic center is actually located in about 6 degrees Sagittarius. It's 27 degrees Sagittarius in the Western astrological zodiac, but in the actual constellation, the point is about 6 degrees Sagittarius. It's kind of misleading to think about it as a point, by the way. This gives rise to some misunderstanding and some sort of spurious criticism of my work. It's applying a too accurate kind of interpretation and then dismissing it by route of accuracy or something, because the galactic center is really like this sort of nebulous nuclear bulge in the region of early Sagittarius and late Scorpio. So in terms of the timing of this, we can actually think of a range for the timing, which we'll get into here in another slide here in a minute. And what we find in Vedic tradition is that, according to astrologer David Frawley, writing in his book, Astrology of the Seers, the galactic center is called Brahma, the creative force, or Vishnu Nabi, the navel of Vishnu. From the galactic sun emanates the light, which determines the life and intelligence on Earth. Okay, now in my book Galactic Alignment, I offered interpretations of religious traditions from the old world that seem to be pointing to the galactic center and precession as important features. Mithraism was the state religion of Rome for about 400 years, between about 50 BC and 350 AD. It was the sort of world religion at the time, and then Christianity eclipsed it. Mithraism involves the sacrifice of the bull. Here's Mithras stabbing the bull in the shoulder, and it's believed that this symbolizes the end of the age of Taurus. So it's a processional mythos. The symbology of all these different Mithraic monuments is really interesting. According to one of the widely accepted interpretations, Mithras is Perseus, and he's stabbing the Taurus bull. I'll go over to this next slide here and come back. The Pleiades are located on the shoulder of the bull, and you have these torchbearers on the left and the right. This torchbearer is holding the up torch, this torchbearer is holding the down torch, so that's representing the descent process and the ascent process. And then you have the Sirius, the dog star, and a snake who is possibly the lunar nodes, or perhaps Draco. But the main thing here is that you have the zodiac wheel going around, and you have Sagittarius and Scorpio, and there's a lot of action happening right here. There's action happening right here too, where the dagger is going into the bull's shoulder. That's where the Pleiades are. So that indicates the flood of nutrients, blood, the symbolism of coming into manifestation and birth. And on the opposite side here, you have a close-up. The foot of Mithras in this part of the sky, I believe, refers to Ophiuchus. And then you have the stinger of the scorpion and the arrow of the Sagittarius. All this is happening in the galactic center. This is the prime sort of place of focus for Mithraic monuments. It's unbelievable that scholars haven't really pointed this out and made the direct connection to the galactic center. And that part of the sky is where the gates are located. It's where the Milky Way and the zodiac intersect. So there's a lot of traditions in the old world we find in like Islamic astrology, the doctrine of the lunar nodes. We have this cosmological concept of the 8 celestial spheres. It's a Platonic idea, and we find it manifesting, say, in the Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy of Dante, written about 1300 AD. You have this old cosmological idea of the 8 planetary spheres, and then at the top you have the ladder, which Jeff went into the symbolism of the ladder quite a bit, and how the ladder leads us through the doorway into the divine Empyrean, which is located in the Milky Way. See all these stars here? So this is the cross of here's the ecliptic, and here's the Milky Way, and the doorway is where the Milky Way and the ecliptic intersect. It's where the galactic center is, and then, you're there. Also, so we have that encoded in Jacob. This is kind of a glimpse, really. It's a tantalizing glimpse. This is a woodcut by Christian mystic Jacob Boehme, esoteric thinker. And he's portraying the celestial sphere with a band of the zodiac, but in the center, he's not placing the pole star there. He's placing the stinger of Scorpio. There's the symbol for Scorpio. So that's where the galactic center is, and for some reason he's placing the galactic center in the center of the sky. All right, now this gets kind of interesting here. William Blake, who you're all probably familiar with, he was influenced by Neoplatonic thought that was being translated by Thomas Taylor in the late 1700s. A lot of amazing Platonic doctrines were coming through, like information from Macrobius and Porphyry on the cave of the nymphs, and sort of these esoteric secrets from the ancient Neoplatonic philosophers and so on. Very unpopular in that day. It was, you know, you weren't supposed to talk about this kind of stuff. It was thought of as being pagan and heretical and that kind of thing. That's why William Blake wrote in such an obscure way. You know, he had to encode these amazing esoteric secrets in his poetry and in his paintings. This is a painting that William Blake did in 1821 called The Sea of Time and Space. This painting was lost until 1947 when it was found on an estate in England. And it's basically portraying an episode from Homer's Odyssey. And what you have here is the cave of the nymphs, where the caves are coming down from the cave into the sphere of manifestation. And then here's life, living life. And then at the end of life, departing over the seas to finally be drawn up into the heavens, which is the Milky Way. And this horizon line, I would suggest, would be thought of as the ecliptic. So you have ascent and descent. You have this circular process, which is really the core of what scholars refer to as William Blake's circle of destiny, that he writes about quite a bit. Here's a close-up of the soul reascending back into the sky, and here's the chariot of Jehovah, as Blake styled it, but it's really representative. This is the galactic center point, being drawn back up into the sky in the Milky Way, and then here's the descent through the cave of manifestation in the galactic anti-center region, the two celestial gateways. We can kind of simplify this picture. I made this drawing, excuse the lines, where you have the cave of incarnation coming into manifestation, traveling the road of life, and then reascending back into, here's the dark rift, and here's the nuclear bulge, and the Milky Way. So there's this circular process going on here. And it's, as you can see, it's symbolic not only of the road of an individual life, but it's symbolic of the great cycle of precession. Simplifying it even more, we have the solstice suns coming into alignment with the two gateways, and it's this circle of destiny. And the Macrobian gateways, of course, are central to that. Now, the point of me emphasizing this is to say that the galactic cosmology that I've reconstructed for the Maya is actually a core understanding of, I guess what you'd say, something that was coming through into Western religions. And it is deeply encoded into Western religions. We could get into a whole discussion about the revelation of St. John and how that encodes precession and how it points to the year 2000 as the time of, you know, the second coming and that kind of thing. That's a whole other discussion. I won't get into that here. But these traditions point to the years around 2012 as the time of turnabout, or the time of ascent. And in fact, it's encoded, as Vincent Bridges and Jay Widener talk about in their book, The Mystery of the Cross of Henday. It's encoded into the symbology of Christian churches, especially during the Romanesque and Gothic Renaissance period in France in the 13th century, 12th and 13th century. And it is about the alignment in the center of the cross. All right. Well, let's see here. We're almost getting to the point. Kind of like to shift gears a little bit here. Talk about the sort of like the details of the alignment. Now, as you can see, there's a great deal of work that I've done to sort of bring this all together. It's this sort of interdisciplinary synthesis of different fields of study and painting this sort of grand reconstruction of these galactic dimensions in our spiritual histories. Now, you might have seen in the folder handout that there was a handout by Carl Kalaman in which he's saying, and I want to address this a little bit here, because he's saying that there are astronomers who have looked at the Maya calendar and they say that there's nothing special that happens in 2012. And then there's a website link there. I've been to that website, and the first point in that website is interesting because they say, some authors say that the sun aligns with the galactic center in 2012. Okay, well, first of all, you have to say the December solstice sun aligns with the galactic center in 2012. You have to specify that as the specific sun that you're talking about. But they don't. They leave that term out. And so by way of that, they can say, well, the sun crosses through the galactic center in any epoch of precession, which is true. But see how they did that? It was very clever. They left out one of the terms. It's like if I said crab apples are bitter, everybody could agree with that, right? But if I said apples are bitter, you'd go, I don't know if that guy knows what he's talking about. So it's kind of interesting how the so-called debunkers can use kind of a goofy kind of logic to sort of dismiss something. Another thing that is criticized is in saying that the December solstice sun lines up with the Milky Way or the galactic equator. This is the more precise way to talk about it, by the way, to say that the December solstice sun aligns with the galactic equator, which is the precise sort of dotted line that goes down the middle of the Milky Way. The Milky Way is actually quite wide, but it has this sort of precise abstract middle line. It's called the galactic equator. And the calculation on this astronomers have made, the European astronomer Jean Meus, in his book Mathematical Astronomy Morsels, came out in 1997, he calculated that this would the precise center point of the sun would line up with the galactic equator in 1998. And the U.S. Naval Observatory made that same calculation. So astronomers will say, well, this happened in 1998, it doesn't happen in 2012, which is in a sense true if you're going to access the most precise information on it. But to say that the December solstice sun is in alignment with the galactic equator in 2012 is absolutely true because the sun is half a degree wide. So it's actually technically true to say that the December solstice sun is still in alignment with the galactic equator in 2012. It's on the far end of the process. What we have to really think about, because the sun is half a degree wide, that half a degree is 36 years of precessional motion. So if we take 1998 as the exact midpoint of the process, we really have to think about a zone of, say, 1980 to the year 2016. So I've been talking about this from the very beginning, from my first articles on this in 1994, so it's not something that I've ever shied away from looking at. The idea that it disqualifies the thesis is really kind of goofy because what we're really talking about is a forward calculation to a precessional alignment that was made by early sky watchers at the site of Izapa some 2,000 years ago. So you might say that there's a 14-year error between 1998 and 2012, but is that really enough to disqualify the thesis? I think actually even a greater error would have been allowable. You know, to have a 14-year error in a 2,000-year forward calculation in precession is actually negligible. It's actually very impressive that they got it that close. So you have to watch out, in the same way that, Doug and Dave or some of the crop circle debunkers will use kind of half-true sort of logic and then sort of try to dismiss something. You have to watch out for where a person is actually coming from in their intention. And so this galactic alignment is part of this great circle of destiny that we're involved in this process of ascent and descent. All right. I'm going to get into the intro of the spiritual ascent at the end of time, the Pyramid of Fire, the Lost AZTEC Codex. And we have probably about 10 minutes and then I'll take a few questions, and then we'll break at about 10 to 11, just for about 10 minutes, and come back at 11, and I'll read from the 13 pages of the Pyramid of Fire. Well, it's an interesting story. This whole story of how the Pyramid of Fire has come to be. It's been at least 43 years in the making. I like to say that because it was back in 1961 that a beat poet named Marty Matz was living in Mexico. He's an interesting character. Marty Matz was part of the incipient beat poetic scene in the Village in 1955. Over the years, he did jazz readings with Dizzy Gillespie, and he danced with Kerouac, and did poetry readings with Ginsberg. He fled the Village scene in 1957, and he went out to the West Coast and San Francisco, and he met some of the poets from that scene out there, Bob Kaufman, Gregory Corso, and he was out there for a while, and they were renting this old, huge railroad station, and it was kind of like the West Coast annex of the Village, and Neil Cassidy came through, and all these figures that became icons in the beat poetry scene, although 1957 was before the whole story kind of hit the fan. That was right around the time that Ginsberg's Howl came out, and Jack Kerouac's book came out around that time. And before the scene really kind of broke through, Marty left. He was sort of following the beat of a different drummer, even within the progressive milieu of the beat scene itself, and he went to Mexico in 1957, and on that first trip he was gone for 4 years, and he lived in the villages, and he traveled around, and he started compiling a Mazatec Indian language dictionary. He knew Spanish, and there's a lot of interesting anecdotal stories that are covered in this book, because this book is a little bit unusual in its structure, because it's part spiritual biography of Marty Matz, it's epic poetry, it's perennial tradition, it's spiritual teachings, and most importantly, there's also a short story in here by Marty that's very entertaining. It gives a sense for what his journey was like as he was getting closer and closer to finding his peititi, the end of his spiritual quest, which in his short story ends when he finds the village where he then lived for many years, and became friends with this Mazatec Indian shaman named Don Daniel. And after knowing Don Daniel for quite a while and compiling his Mazatec dictionary and so on, Marty was shown this pictographic manuscript. It was pulled out and shown to Marty, and Don Daniel told Marty that he wanted to read or perform the text of the pictures. It's what is called a dramaturgy, kind of like a liturgy, but it's a dramaturgy, where it's actually what the Aztecs and the Maya people would do with their pictographic manuscripts. They used them as like memory devices to read out the creation stories and to read out the sacred wisdom. They were like glyphic memory triggers, so that they would then perform the drama of creation and spiritual journey, encoding many teachings. So Marty was chosen to do this task, and he transcribed the reading that Don Daniel gave and translated it then from there into English. And the result was 13 pages of transcribed text. That was 1961. Marty's fortunes went through many vicissitudes over the years. He spent 4 years in the infamous Lucumberry prison in Mexico, which is a whole anecdotal story in itself. And he went back to the San Francisco scene in 1961, primarily because with the 13 pages of this amazing text, he knew that he had something important, and he had sort of a calling and a mission to from Don Daniel to give this to the world. And he performed it and read it in some of the early poetry scene in San Francisco in 1961. In fact, at that time, he made a recording with Jack Kerouac, and we have this. It's very difficult to sort of hear a lot of it, but if you boost the signal, you can hear it. And so we have Marty reading the 13 pages of the codex from 1961, and at the end of the tape, we have Jack Kerouac reading a few of his poems. And this tape was very important because it resurfaced at a very late stage of the process, because between 1961 and 1994, when Marty contacted me, he had lost the 13th page. You know, he had traveled around so much, and he lived in Thailand with his wife Barbara for about 4 years, and just in all his travels he had somehow misplaced or lost the 13th page. So with this tape that resurfaced, I was able to transcribe that lost 13th page, which is one of the most important pages because it involves the new fire ceremony and the ekpyrosis, or the conflagration, or the spiritual ascent back into union with the infinite eternal Godhead at the end of the cycle. Let's see here. Marty was able to transcribe this, and so when he contacted me in 1994, I was initially suspicious. Terence McKenna, who wrote the introduction for my book, My Cosmogenesis 2012, suggested that Marty contact me about it, and Marty did, and he sent me the transcription of the 13 pages, and I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. But I was suspicious, could I really believe that this was authentic? Talking to Marty through a couple of different means of looking at the text and comparing it to what we know about Central Mexican mythology and religion, I came to the conclusion that this was indeed an unusual example of an authentic performance of a pictographic manuscript. Very rare in that sense. We have many pictographic manuscripts in the museums from Central Mexico. There's the Codex Borbonicus, there's the Nuttall Codex, there's the Borgia Codex, and so on. And scholars have tried to interpret these, and they've made some progress in identifying deities and so on, but those scholarly interpretations are missing sort of that spiritual dimension that comes through when the pictographic memory devices are performed by an authentic lineage keeper. Don Daniel was the lineage keeper for this tradition. In fact, he claimed that his family line went back to the time of the conquest, when his family were sort of like Mazatec adjuncts to the Aztec throne or something like that. They were a royal family at one time. And so it appears that this pre-conquest pictographic manuscript was preserved very carefully. It's a very, the continuity, and the conservatism, you might say, in these traditions is very strong. And he had brought this out because he felt like it was time for this information to be shared. As we know, many indigenous traditions feel like we're approaching a very critical nexus in human history, and so they're trying to bring out their sacred knowledge to be offered to the world, hopefully to help things go smoothly in this great time of challenge and transformation. So that was what happened, and I actually, once I realized that there was something important here, I talked to Marty about trying to get it published and so on, and I started reading the text myself, and I found that it had this amazing sort of transformative quality, which is not surprising. That's what these epic texts were sort of designed to be like that. Epic poetry can be like that. Poetry is something that the bards and shamans would use to sort of get into a trance state, to alter the consciousness, to put us into experiential contact with another dimension. Like, for example, another epic tradition that I love a lot is the Finnish oral tradition in the far north from Finland, the Kalevala, the national epic of the Finns. That has an interesting sort of meter to it, that when it's chanted, they believe that if you chant the chapter or the runo, they're called runos, if you chant the runo that's about the origin of iron, it puts you into contact with, it gives you power over iron. Like, for example, one of the runos is interesting. It is the origin of iron, runo, so if you can chant that runo, you have power over iron. Now, quite strangely, we find that little incantation or hex or runo inside of a story that Vainamoinen, one of the heroes in the Kalevala, he slashes open his knee accidentally, so he's bleeding profusely, and he's going around from village to village looking for the origin of iron runo. He has to find it in order to staunch the blood flow from his knee. And so he finally does find an old pack peddler who knows the rune, and he sings it. Singing is a magical incantation thing. And so then in singing the origin of iron rune, he's able to staunch the blood flow. Why would that be? If you have power over iron, why would that stop the flow of blood? Hemoglobin. You know, iron in blood, that kind of thing. That's kind of interesting too, because that indicates that there's a great amount of sort of herbal medicine, esoteric lore encoded in these ancient things. The Pyramid of Fire is a multi-dimensional book. It not only deals with the 13-step program from creation to ekpyrosis, it also, there's the calendars in it, medicine. There's a yoga of sublimation, which is about becoming a Quetzalcoatl. There's incredible, insightful information about the true meaning of sacrifice, which is so controversial today, and the deity names that Marty was able to sort of identify and figure out and, you know, and place in the codex in their correct place. The deity names are just amazing. You have like Citlalinikwe, Mictlante Kutli, you know, all these kind of mantric deity names, very interesting. So, so after so many years, the book finally came out. We actually submitted the book concept to a couple of publishers back in '96 and sort of promoted it as the real Celestine prophecy story. I thought that might be a good hook, but it didn't seem to work. So it took another couple of years. We were working on sort of how to formulate this. Marty then started to write a novella, a short, well, it's a novella now because he never finished it, but it was sort of like a fanciful story of his relationship with Don Daniel and how he took a spiritual journey into the sacred mushroom caves in the sacred caves of Cerro Rabon, which is a sacred mountain in AZTEC country in the northern part of Oaxaca. These areas are actually very, they're remote, and the AZTEC people are very conservative, but there's some history for these areas. The other village near the village where the codex comes from is Huatla de Jimenez, which was the famous village where the mushroom religion was rediscovered by Gordon Wasson in the 1950s. So there's a lot of esoteric secrets and visionary shamanic medicine and work that's being done in these areas. As for the original codex, we don't have the original codex. In the same way that it's believed that the Popol Vuh, the creation myth of the Maya, was transcribed from a pictographic hieroglyphic manuscript, probably something more like the Dresden Codex or something like that. In the 1550s, just the way that we have the transcription of it, it seems like the Quiche Maya people who were transcribing it and writing down the creation myth, they were actually looking at pictures, because they'll say like, and here we have, you know, the hero twins doing this, and here over here we have the hero twins doing. So it's like they're looking at pictures and they're transcribing it into the story. The Popol Vuh, we don't have the original pictographic manuscript, but we do have the transcribed text, and we have the added value that it was transcribed or interpreted or performed by authentic lineage keepers. So that's what places the Pyramid of Fire Codex into the same category of uniqueness as the Popol Vuh. Marty passed away in late 2001. Over the years, he, you know, being such an expatriate, he was out of the country a lot of the time, although he did put some of his poetry collections together. There was a collection called Time Waits, and the frontispiece poem that I took from Time Waits goes, "Time waits, a sometimes mossy line between November and the sea. Time waits for me alone, turning slowly from sound of bass and neon solitude to the 2 o'clock ache of warm green on the mountain. Time waits, and somewhere, out beyond the Mexico City blues, 2 bird-like hearts beat their way from dream to dream, searching for a field of music in the restless palm of eternity." And something that sort of gives a glimpse of Marty's approach to life comes from another poem that he wrote called "A Funny Thing Happened on My Way to Enlightenment." This is just a little excerpt from the poem. "In this world I chose to wander, from miracle to marvel to wonder. I learned all things open, and life indeed unfolds. I have never hesitated to throw away my wallet, to make room in my pockets for poems or rainbows, which I carried till the rainbows turned to tattered colors, and the poems became just dust." So he was kind of like a wandering, mendicant, bhikkhu bum in the Jack Kerouac tradition, where he was oriented to the spiritual vision. You know, he was always oriented to that. And so who's to say that that's not the appropriate person for the gods and goddesses to choose to manifest and transcribe something like the Pyramid of Fire? We have a great benefit from the fact that Marty, when he returned to his hometown of Brooklyn, New York, in 2000, he connected with a local band called Church of Betty, and Chris Rail did readings and recordings with Marty in the last summer of his life. So if you go to fangrecords.com, you'll find 2 CDs that are really amazing and evocative of Marty's poetic gifts. I think of him as sort of the unrecognized and unfortunately overshadowed beat poet. The 2 CD collections are called Sky of Fractured Feathers and Pipe Dreams. Pipe Dreams is a collection of his opium-inspired poetry when he lived in Thailand. So he was about the ecstatic vision, you know. This is sort of like in the tradition of the Romantic poets, like Shelley and Keats, and even, I guess, William Butler Yeats to some extent. And in the sense that poetry is supposed to be something that elevates us, puts us into contact. It's an ecstatic expression. It's like the bardic thing, you know, like Van Morrison or something like that. It's what bards and poets do, not just for some aesthetic, you know, thing, you know, for entertaining value. It's more like a bardic process, you know. Like I said the other day, all true knowledge comes from an ecstatic connection with the transcendent. And that's what the kind of poetry that Marty wrote was intended to do, and that's what really the Pyramid of Fire is intended to do. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up here. It's about 20 to 11. So we probably be good to I'd like to open it up for questions now because we probably won't have time as we're approaching 12 noon. I'd like to try to get through as much of the text of the 13 pages as possible, not just a straight reading all the way through, but sort of doing commentary at the same time. And that'll probably take most of the time after we get back from the break. So I'd like to, if there's any questions at all right now, we can have a few questions, or we can go right to break, if that's what people want to do. And I can't see much. Okay.
Can you please use the audience mic up here so it'll go into the recording?
Walk up and line up by the mic.
I'll just repeat the question, okay? Okay.
What do you think is the probability that the two sites of Teotihuacan and Iztapa as the two polarities where Chichen Itza in the center, that those two sites were actually put together by the same person, let's say Thoth, in the form of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan?
Okay. Here's the question. What is the possibility that the two sites in Mexico, Teotihuacan and Izapa, that seem to be the places where these two polar expressions of the processional doctrine were put together, what is the possibility that those two sites were sort of inspired or designed by the same person? Like, for example, Thoth. That's okay. I think that's interesting. I would say that the same spirit of esoteric wisdom might be behind the origin of those two places. I don't know if it would be the exact same person, like you mean like a traveling sort of sky watcher or teacher, you might say. I suppose it's possible that there could have been, I would think that it would be more like a band of roving sky watchers or something like that, perhaps led by one figure who was interested in calibrating the sky from different latitudes and so on. Could have done that. Or you could also say that there's one central animating impulse that is behind the way that these sites were sort of calibrated and placed where they are placed. Yeah, right there. Oh, yes, there's a mic over there. Okay, there's a mic over there.
Thank you for bringing in so many of the mystery and esoteric traditions and weaving it into this workshop here at the culmination. It was magnificent, and you're a one-man Library of Alexandria, and we all thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Question about Sri Yukteswar. I believe he posited a theory of the dual sun for our solar system.
Mm-hmm.
And does that have any relationship at all to some of the galactic alignment or anything else that you can think of?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sri Yukteswar posited the existence of a dual companion, a dark companion of the sun, around which our solar system revolves. Now, this is one of those sort of interesting new areas that are being explored. My personal bias, and I'm willing to sort of hear alternative views, and there is a very interesting alternative view on this. My interpretation of that is that the dual that Yukteswar was really referring to there, or what is really referred to in the doctrine, is the galactic center. So instead of an orbital thing, you have a processional thing, like the sun is precessing around the zodiac to come back into union with its dual, which is the galactic center. Now that's my interpretation. There's Walter Cruttenden, the Great Year Research Group, the Binary Research Institute. He's actually taken Yukteswar's words at face value, and it's yielded a very, very interesting result. The Binary Research Institute, you could probably Google that, and what they're looking at actual astrophysical data that suggests that precession might not be so much an Earth wobble, but this orbital period, an actual orbital period around a dark companion, like dark matter companion, that we can't see, that is out beyond the edge of our solar system, that we are actually orbiting in a period of 24,000 years or 26,000 years. And Walter actually organized a conference on precession that took place in Vancouver just last month, and I was invited to speak there. And it was a great think tank group. And it promises to be an annual event. And to just have a conference on precession alone is pretty amazing, so I was excited to do that. So there's a couple of different things going on there. Although I have my own view on what might be behind that world age doctrine that Yukteswar wrote about in the Holy Science, I think that there's really interesting work being done that might be more directly connected with Yukteswar's interpretation. Yeah. Okay.
I would also like to echo gratitude for your amazing cross-comparison of all these different spiritual traditions. That's really wonderful. And also about Sri Yukteswar, maybe you could speak to this. My recollection of the Holy Science was that he said in it that there had been an error in calculation, I believe by the Vedic mathematicians, regarding the Kali Yuga, and that actually we've already started to come out of it. And I was wondering if you had come across references in any of these other traditions that made any comment about that.
You've gone right to the heart of the presentation that I gave in Vancouver. The error by the Hindu mathematicians around the year 500, there was Aryabhata was a Hindu mathematician, and he reinterpreted the ancient Vedic doctrines of the Great Year, which we find in texts like the Laws of Manu. In the Laws of Manu, you can add up the various periods of the Satya Yuga and so on to arrive at the figure 12,000 years. And Yukteswar is tuned into that, and that's where that, he was supporting that original processional idea that we find in the Laws of Manu. Now, Aryabhata, actually, he was influenced by Greek ideas about the great year, in which the Greeks weren't, even at that time, they weren't fully appreciative of the idea that the sky moves, that the stars move. It was somewhat heretical, because in the Greek world, the stars were fixed. So even after Hipparchus discovered precession in the 2nd century BC, the Greeks still couldn't wrap their brain around it. So they wanted to think of the great year as being caused by all the planetary periods coming back around until all the planets line up in the 1st degree of Aries. That's called a conjunctional cycle for the great year. It doesn't have anything to do with precession, but it was one way that they were trying to grapple with, the great year phenomenon. Now, Aryabhata, he was influenced by these Greek ideas, yet he was encountering this early Vedic Yuga doctrine that added up to 24,000 years, which clearly refers to precession. 24,000 years is not enough time for all the planets to come back around and conjunct in one. In fact, it can't even really happen to that degree of precision, or even generally speaking. So what Aryabhata did, and it was kind of irresponsible, being a mathematician and being sort of a purveyor of that early scientific idea of precision and specialization, he added factors of 360. He multiplied the Yuga periods by factors of 360 to generate these monstrously large Yuga numbers. And people quote that a lot, like the Yuga lasts 432 million years or something like that. Well, these come from sort of artificially expanded Yuga periods. So then Aryabhata had enough time to work with that he could work out when the planets actually conjuncted inside of that. So that's kind of an error that was introduced into the Yuga doctrine at that time, and it kind of distracted from thinking about it as a processional process.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Any other questions at this point? I'm blinded by the light. Okay. Well, we're right on schedule. We can take like a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the final hour, and I'll do readings from the Pyramid of Fire text. Thank you.